never seen anything like it. Violent protests have spread to at least 20 cities across America.
Europe continues to struggle to contain the coronavirus.
A major police emergency unfolding in London
there
tonight.
There are reports of injuries, bodies on the ground.
Deadly U.S. evacuation from Afghanistan.
Israeli airstrikes targeted militants in Gaza.
The White House was under lockdown late.
It is the deadliest terror attack in France in decades.
The UN estimates almost 1 million people have fled their homes.
Because the war in Ukraine has begun.
Hey, beloved, welcome back to the Maranatha Global Bible Study on the Book of Revelation. In previous sessions, we've been discussing the different interpretations that Christians have offered with regard to the identity of the great harlot, of Babylon the Great, of Revelation 17 and 18. And as I said in previous episodes, this is a really funny topic because people who hold their different interpretations, different theories, I mean, they hold them with a tight grip. I mean, they are adamant. Like, it is clearly, you can see it in some of the comments. Even before I got to the particular sessions, people are like, clearly, this is obviously talking about Rome, like unarguably. And then others are like, no, it's unarguably talking about Jerusalem. And then, of course, you have quite a few that say, no, it's clearly, absolutely talking about New York City or the United States. And so, as I joked, we should sort of just put all three or four, because there's a few other interpretations of the folks that hold these interpretations, and just put them in a room and just let them sort of duke it out. But what I've been trying to do is just walk through the different interpretations, again, using the analogy of the glove. Looking at the different biblical criteria that the Bible gives us and weighing that against the reality on the ground and saying, here are the strengths and here are the difficulties with each of these positions. Now, today we're going to discuss the United States. And this is, as I said, one of the interpretations of which the proponents of hold on to it and defend it with gusto. So this ought to be a pretty controversial session. But to be clear, this is, again, it's not just end-time trivia. We're not just sort of geeking out, talking prophecy that doesn't have any relevance for us today. What we believe, I mean, if you believe that the United States is the great harlot, that should at least affect the way that you relate to the United States. It should affect your life in some pretty profound ways that we'll discuss. Now, a pretty high percentage of those who are watching the Maranatha Global Bible Study are Americans, but I know there's many from all over the world who are not. Okay, regardless as to your nationality or where you live, what we believe about these things really does matter. There actually is practical, pastoral, ground realities in terms of how these things affect our lives. So a few of the books that argue in favor of the United States as Babylon, and there's probably a few more that have been written since I wrote my book on Mystery Babylon, one of which is called The Final Babylon, America and the Coming of the Antichrist. It's by three different co-authors, Krieger, McGriff, and Doug Woodward. I actually know Douglas. Really nice guy. Appreciate him. Very much disagree with him on this particular issue. In their book, a quote is, and here's an example of the kind of sort of dogmatic statements that people use to support their views. It says, only the United States of America can muster the money and the might to be the final Babylon of Revelation 18. And then here's an example of how our interpretations of what could seem to be sort of irrelevant eschatological matters affect the way we live. Here's a quote. They say, we have met the enemy, and he is us. So again, just to be clear, Revelation 17 and 18 is talking about the great harlot, the greatest source of idolatry, of spiritual immorality in the earth in the last days. And to say that's the United States, that's a pretty significant claim. Okay, another couple books that argue for this position. And I would say this one is probably the best, or at least it's the most comprehensive. It's a book just called The Babylon, America's Destiny Foretold in Biblical Prophecy by a man named R.A. Coombs. It's a little bit of an older book. And Coombs claims to present 33 specific traits, or again, criteria, that the Bible gives us that align with the United States. So he really tries to lay out a very comprehensive case. Now, what Coombs does is he doesn't simply look at Revelation 17 and 18. He actually goes back to Isaiah 14 and 15, as well as Jeremiah 50 and 51. In fact, those are the passages where he draws the most information from. And he says those are actually, those particular chapters, those passages are not just speaking of historical Babylon, rather they're speaking of the ultimate end-time Babylon. And again, he argues that they're talking about the United States. A couple other books. One is called The End of America by a man named John Price. He passed away several years ago. It might be 10 years ago now. Another one, here's a inflammatory title, America Will Burn by Nathan Ford. No pun intended. And then here's another real interesting one. And again, this highlights the relevance of what we believe about this. It's Getting Out, your guide to leaving America. Okay, because it says in the text, it says to those who are in Babylon, come out of her, my people, right? So that you won't partake of her sins, her iniquities, or her judgments. And so if we believe the United States is Babylon, then it seems to follow that we should get out. Now, for what it's worth, of these different authors, the only one that I know of that actually took his message to heart and left was John Price. John Price actually, for the last, I'm going to say, decade of his life, moved to, I could be wrong, I think it was Panama, someplace there in Central America. But again, he took his message seriously, and he said, I believe the United States is Mystery Babylon, and I need to leave. Or you could just say he used that as an excuse to go hang out in Central America. I don't know. But the point is, he actually followed through. So when I see someone that's written a book that says the United States is Mystery Babylon, I go, then why do you live in Louisiana? Why do you live in Arkansas or, wherever, right? Like, if you really believe this and you're telling people that they need to flee, have you led by example? And so John Price is the only one of the different authors that I know that actually did flee. So the strengths of this view, let me begin with the strengths and then we'll work through kind of a mixture of the strengths and weaknesses. So, and let me just say this before I begin. Some who make this argument, they focus specifically, not just on the United States in general, but New York City specifically. They essentially frame New York City as the city that represents the larger United States. So some really focus on New York City is the city, the great city, Mystery Babylon. Others expand it a bit more and they say it's the United States. It's really sort of a combination between Washington, D.C., New York City, Las Vegas, and Hollywood. Sort of combine them all together even though they're a few thousand miles apart. And you have the primary cities that represent the United States. And, one is the political heart of the United States. One is the economic heart. New York City, of course, with Wall Street. Hollywood is the sort of the moral entertainment influencer of the world. Las Vegas, of course, just being a city of incredible corruption and wickedness and so forth. So they'll just sort of combine them all. So I'm not really specifying, I'm sort of critiquing all of the positions together as if they're all just really one and the same. Some take, again, a bit more of a specific approach. So New York City, if we're talking about New York City, then indeed, it is a very literal great city. And as we talked about when we were reading through Revelation 17 and 18, 8 times it refers to Babylon as the great city. And again, the symbol or the analogy, the metaphor that's used by the Bible is this prostitute, this woman. But that's a symbol. She's not literally a woman. It explains to us what she represents. She is the great city that rules over the kings of the earth, that sits on many waters, peoples, tongues, nations, etc. She is a very real city that has a profound influence on the kings and the peoples of the earth. So in that sense, you could say, well, New York City meets that particular criterion. It matches, it aligns with being a great city. In fact, it's one of the greatest cities in the history of mankind. You go, okay, I get that. That's a valid point. New York City also, and this is interesting, it is a very literal port city. So Revelation 7 verse 1, it talks about this woman who sits on many waters. So when you look at New York City with all of its different boroughs, Manhattan, etc., it's, islands and so forth, connected by bridges and land bridges and so forth. And you go, yeah, New York City as a city, it sits on many waters. It's a port city. We talked about this, the fact that some of the primary peoples that are connected to Mystery Babylon when it's destroyed are shipmasters, sailors, those who make their living on the water, and they see her burning. So she seems to be described as a port city. New York City matches that description perfectly. And it's really difficult just in terms of the power of imagery, not to flash back to 9/11 when you saw the Twin Towers burning and smoking, from a distance, to see that smoke rising from New York City and not relate it to this description in the book of Revelation where the city is just smoking and those on the sea are looking, going, oh my gosh, their mouths are wide open. Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. So it's easy to sort of look at New York City and go, yes, this is the modern version of ancient Rome. Yes, this is the modern version of ancient Babylon. That's an easy connection to make. So I want to give credence there. As I said, the broader interpretation includes the United States. It combines, it views the entire United States. So it combines D.C., New York, Las Vegas, and Hollywood. And it's not difficult at all just to say, well, yes, the United States in many ways, it's sort of the modern version of ancient Rome, like the great source of influence all over the world. And to a degree, that is true. To a degree, that is true. We're going to get into some of the reasons why it's not true, specifically in terms of what the Bible is focusing on. Okay, but like Rome, so here's just a few examples. Like Rome, the United States is sort of the pinnacle of global power. You could say we're the most powerful geopolitical entity in the earth. You could say that. You could say China may have bypassed us. We're increasingly on the decline. But at least for most of the last 100 years, we've been the most powerful nation in the world, economically, militarily, etc., etc. Like Rome, the influence of the United States is vast. We have a military that is feared far and wide. We have an excellent, arguably the most powerful military in the world. Arguably, that again may have changed. China is a formidable force. Like Rome, the moral underpinnings of the United States are collapsing rapidly. Now, it's not just the United States, it's the whole world. But the moral underpinnings, the values of the United States are collapsing. And I would say that is global. But in many ways, the United States oftentimes leads the way, but not always. You can find some bizarre, insane stuff no matter where you go. At the time of this recording, I'm leaving in a few days, heading to Sweden. You can find examples of incredible moral decay in some of the more modern European nations that sort of view themselves as bastions of progressive, shining light on a hill. The whole world wants to be like us, this type of thing. You get quite a few nations that view themselves in that way, but again are filled with moral depravity. The more they embrace progressivism and the progressive agenda, the more that you have a correlating moral decay. But despite any of these things, like the other interpretations of Mystery Babylon that we've looked at, again, whether it be Rome or Jerusalem, there are also profound problems, major problems, I would say, deal breakers with regard to the identity of the United States as Babylon. So despite all of these things, the fatal problem, let's just begin here. Mystery Babylon the Great, the great harlot, first and foremost, beyond any of the other criteria that the Bible offers us, She represents the single greatest source of immorality, of idolatry, of false religion. She is the great Babylon. Babylon, again, was in the Old Testament, it was the capital of the reigning satanic, pagan, heathen empire. They worshiped false gods. It was the greatest fountainhead of the worship of Satan in the earth, of Marduk, of the various Babylonian gods. This was the heart of idolatry. The United States, for all of its faults, for all of its shortcomings, for all of its corruption, and I don't want to underplay any of that, for all of those things, the United States does not represent a religion. New York City does not represent a false religion. The United States is the melting pot of numerous religions, the greatest of which, the greatest influence, the greatest number of people here are Christians. It's second, also, the greatest home outside of Israel to Jews globally. And yes, you've got Muslims and Hindus and Buddhists and Satanists and Wiccans and you name it, like you've got every religion in the world here, but we don't really represent a false pagan religion. We are not the greatest source of religious influence in the world. We are not primarily influencing the world to worship other gods, to follow other religions. Now, as we'll get into, some people say, well, we do have a religion. It's capitalism or it's consumerism or this type of thing. We'll kind of get to that. But again, that's not really a religion. It's not a formalized religion. Mystery Babylon represents the single greatest source of spiritual immorality in the earth. And let me just say, there are other excellent candidates to fulfill that particular criterion that the United States doesn't even begin to come close to. The great harlot does not merely represent general forms of idolatry, as I said, such as materialism or consumerism or capitalism. And by the way, let me just say this, I am a dyed-in-the-wool capitalist. Capitalism to me, yes, it has, anything can be abused. Capitalism to me is economic freedom. That's all it is. It is economic freedom. You give people freedom to be creative, to make wealth, to create inventions, to come up with different ideas. You get the government off of their back and you allow them to be free to create wealth themselves. And when people have freedom, they will pour themselves into it. The more that you control, the more that you regulate, the more that you clamp down on individual creativity, you are clamping down on that which God put in us. Creativity. When we are creative, it's one of the ways that we're most like our Creator. We have been created by our Creator in His image, and that's why we also are creative. And when people clamp down on natural creativity, they are clamping down on one of the most central things that the Lord has placed in all of us. And creativity, when it comes to inventions, or as I said, wealth creation, is very natural. And the more that governments regulate and remove freedoms and impose restrictions, the more that the human soul begins to suffocate. So I just want to say this right out of the gate. I'm very conservative. I am a hardcore supporter of capitalism. I think communism is evil. I think it's satanic. I think it is a demonic perversion of the way that mankind should be governed. Okay, now I understand that you can make good arguments for aspects of elements of socialism, even biblically, in terms of the community taking care of one another and that sort of thing. But still, nevertheless, I will always defend as virtuous capitalism, which again, if you don't like the word capitalism, that's fine. Just use the word freedom. I support freedom. I believe freedom is a virtue, a biblical virtue, a godly virtue. But despite all of these things, the great harlot doesn't simply represent something like consumerism or materialism, which, by the way, are the sort of natural excesses of capitalism. Yes, it can lead to abuse. It can lead to consumerism and materialism and greedy corporate capitalism, this sort of thing. I don't want to underplay, again, some of the errors and abuses of capitalism, but that still doesn't make the root bad. Because some of the branches are bad, it doesn't make the root bad. Okay, Babylon represents the biggest, the greatest source of false religion that mankind has ever known, the United States simply does not match the first and most important criterion, that finger in the glove. The first finger that we're going to try on. Does this fit? No, the United States doesn't meet the religious influence side of it. At least we are a religious influence globally, but not in a negative sense. Whatever shortcomings the United States is guilty of, and we're guilty of many shortcomings. We could get into all kinds of issues presently, right now, in public discourse. It's very popular to discuss racial issues. This is part of the agenda of the left, but by the same token, some of it is very legitimate. And as someone with a transracial, multiracial family, through adoption, some of these racial issues, to me, I find myself very sympathetic to, very understanding of. As a conservative, there's other aspects of them that I find destructive and perverse and twisted and this sort of thing. But nevertheless, the point is this: you can't deny the United States' history of slavery, its history of profound, at its very foundation, racism, which again, I want to be clear, was a global problem. It's certainly not only the United States problem. The United States gets framed as the worst practitioner of slavery in history, but the reality is, and not to underplay the reality of slavery or the harm and the pain, the insanity of it, but the descendants of the slaves, for the most part, have lived. In Islam, they also practiced slavery all across northern Africa, throughout the Arab world, but they turned their slaves into eunuchs. Okay, they castrated their slaves. In other words, the slavery of the Arab world, which numerically far surpassed anything in the United States, and that's demonstrable, it was a genocide. Because they castrated them, they didn't have children. They didn't produce offspring. And so they were just wiped out. Whereas in the United States, the offspring of slaves and many other immigrants that have come, obviously, are alive. And so they're able to express and really point the finger at the realities of the ways the United States has fallen short. But, let me just say this, that does not do away with some of the founding principles in the Constitution of freedom, of liberty, of equality. Yes, we have fallen short of those, but we are constantly, at least, sort of on paper, striving toward those ideals as a people. And let me just say, equality, it's good. It's a good thing. It's a biblical thing. The Bible promotes equality. The founding fathers of the United States, they were imperfect men. Some of them were involved in Masonic this and that, or occultism, and some of them were Christians, and some of them were a mixture between all of the above. Some of them were, they believed in God, but they weren't really devout Christians. Like, they're all over the place. But there's no denying that you had some profound geniuses. In writing the Constitution, they have an amazing grasp of history and the nature of oppression and dictatorships and how people have oppressed mankind. And they ensconced in the American Constitution of the United States, one of the greatest, most brilliant game plans in terms of pursuing things like liberty, equality, and freedom. And so while we have fallen short, and I want to be very clear, yes, we have fallen short, we constantly are pushing on toward a greater pursuit of those things. And that's good. Despite all of our shortcomings, you can't negate the almost miraculous nature of the Constitution of the United States. Like, it's not inspired like the Bible by any means. I'm not a Mormon, don't get me wrong. Mormons almost view the Constitution and some of the founding documents as inspired, almost similar to Scripture. And I don't believe that at all, but I do believe that there was an element of inspiration in many of the founding documents. And the Lord was doing something really beautiful. Again, despite all of its flaws, despite all of its corruption, despite all of its shortcomings, these principles of equality. And now, like, as I say this, you can go, oh, this guy's just like a pro-American. Look, let me just compare it. Let's compare the principles of equality, freedom, liberty, etc., with one of the other great sources of influence in the earth, Islam, the Sunnah of Muhammad, the example that he left behind, the pattern of life and teaching, everything that he said, did, forbid, or condoned. So if you were to follow Islamic law, Sharia, for example, and I always use this as an example because it's very simple, the testimony of a woman in court is only half as valid as the testimony of a man. Only half as valid. So for example, if someone is practicing Sharia law, if you have a nation that's practicing it, it literally says in Islamic law that in order for a man to be convicted of rape, there has to have been 2 men or 4 women who actually witnessed the rape. And it's very specific. I won't get into the details, but it's not just like from a distance they actually have to have seen the actual event itself. 2 men or 4 women. 3 women is not enough to convict. If you have 3 female witnesses that saw someone rape a woman, they saw it and they stand there and say, he raped her, that's not good enough to convict. Okay? The United States, it only takes 1 woman is just as valid as 1 man. The United States system, the United States values there of equality are superior to the principles ensconced in the foundations of Islamic law. Superior. If you're to compare some of the principal ideas that are part and parcel of communism, the American Constitution is superior morally, spiritually, in every which way. Again, it's not perfect. And I always bring up sort of that famous quote, and it may have been Churchill, I'm not really sure who said it, or I'm not even sure who said it, but it's kind of like capitalism is the worst form of government except for every other form of government. In other words, the only thing that's ultimately perfect is a divine, to sort of use the analogy in the movie I'm spacing right now, the Running movie. Dun, 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 dun. Anyway, I'm not going to think of it. Anyway, the point is this. The only thing that we're looking for is a benevolent dictatorship. Okay, we want the Lord himself to rule over a divine, benevolent theocracy. That's the perfect government, when God, the perfect just ruler, rules over mankind. But until then, we have to go with the best that we have. And until then, the best that we have is freedom and capitalism. Okay, so forgive me for my big lecture. The point is this. When you read the books that are trying to frame the United States as Babylon, they go down some dark paths to try to say no, because again, Babylon is the greatest, single worst form of most perverse, satanic, like the worst, most evil thing in the earth. And so if you want to say that's the United States, you will go down some really dark roads, and these books all do, to try to prove that the United States is the worst, most bloodthirsty, most satanic entity in the world. They go down these real dark paths of, look, guys, criticism, bashing someone, accusing someone, tearing them down. This is the easiest thing in the world. Like, it doesn't take any creativity. So this is what Satan does. Satan accuses. Anyone can accuse. Anyone can accuse, but building someone up, calling forth the budding, partial virtues that we see in people, calling forth these little sprouts of righteousness in weak, broken, annoying people's lives. Like that requires some strength. The easiest thing in the world is to accuse. The easiest thing in the world is to tear down. The easiest, laziest thing in the world is to criticize. And so there's no shortage of criticism out there concerning the United States. You can read, again, sort of these borderline communist critiques of the United States, these anarchist critiques of the United States, these Islamic critiques of the United States. You can find all sorts of conspiracy theories, and some of which are valid, don't get me wrong, about the United States. But these become the sources that when someone is trying to argue this, when someone's writing these books, they're going to draw from any place where they can find someone bashing and tearing down and criticizing the United, and they're going to draw from all of that. And I'm not saying that none of it is true or there's not elements of truth to it. It's just that you end up with an incredibly unbalanced, distorted picture of the United States. The United States is just like any person out there, complicated, very complex. And if you only focus on the bad, you're going to have an incredibly unbalanced position. But when you are trying to argue that the United States is the greatest, worst, most vile, disgusting, filthy, spiritual prostitute in the earth at the end of the age, then you're only going to draw from the lurid, the really dark stuff. And that, to me, is a big part of the problem. Again, I've already made it pretty clear. I'm a cheerleader for the United States. This is where I live. I'm under no impression that it's perfect, but I still believe that as a country, we're a country that has historically and even today, even in our current state, even under a president that I don't personally appreciate, controlled by a party that I don't appreciate, despite all of that, we are still a country that brings tremendous good to the world. As a people, we give one of the highest percentages, and I don't just mean the government, I mean individuals, of charity to charity. We are a very generous nation. Like statistically, you can't get around that. And by the way, conservatives are way more generous than liberals. Even as a government, however, we give away more humanitarian aid than any other nation in the world, even to our enemies. When I wrote my book, I used the example when there was this massive earthquake in Iran. We gave away literally tens of millions of dollars and sent aid workers over to Iran, a nation that, for all intents and purposes, views us as the great Satan. We're over there helping. And the United States has this culture because we have such a Judeo-Christian foundation. We're a new country, for the most part, but the foundations of our founding documents, our founding, it was rooted in Judeo-Christian ethics and morals. And many of those things, even among the liberals, still carry over today. Now, beyond this, the United States today, and please hear me when I say this, I'm doing on one hand, on the other hand, I'm trying to be very balanced here. But the United States is presently the greatest source of Christian evangelical missions work around the world, way beyond any other country in the world. We provide roughly 80% of all of the global missionaries around the world come from the United States. You go, really? First of all, we're a big country, but there's plenty of other Christian nations that aren't nearly as much of missionary sending nations as the United States. We are number one. We are the greatest source, even to this day, of proclaiming the gospel throughout the earth beyond any other nation. Not only in terms of the number of missionaries, but the amount of funding for the going forth of the gospel. Similarly, it's roughly 80%. Roughly 80% of all of the funding for missionaries around the world comes from the American church. For all of our problems, for all of our flaws, for all of our bad theology, we are still a profound source of light, sending the gospel out to the nations. Now, it's very difficult to say the single greatest source of gospel proclamation in the world. Again, love us or hate us, you can't get around the fact, that fact. To say the single greatest source of the proclamation of the gospel is the single greatest source of idolatry in the earth. Like, you have this massive contradiction. Unless you want to try to say that the gospel itself is the negative influence, which of course it's not. It's just the exact opposite. And so it's things like this. Again, it's easy to criticize. It's easy to go down the road of seeing a demon behind every tree and seeing the United States as the embodiment of evil. But it requires a little bit more work to point out the good things. It's not very popular in the United States, by the way. Let me just say this too. Because the United States and the Western world at large was founded on Judeo-Christian principles, we are also a confessional people, which means that we tend to be very confessional because Christianity has a history of the confession of sins. Because we're a confessional people, and of course, like the Catholic and Orthodox Church is a little bit more focused on confession. But these values, they remain in a post-Christian culture. So whereas you have an increasing number of people today who are not Christian, they still value the idea of transparency, of honesty, of confessing and owning up to our shortcomings, mistakes, and sins. The Islamic world, they believe in tawbah, so like repentance, but they don't really practice confession. They confess to Allah, they confess to God, but they don't really own up to their sins. So, like when you have horrible things happen, like, Libya shoots down a plane and they get caught. Like, it's clear that they won't own it. They'll say, oh, it was the Israelis. It was those evil Jews. Like the Arab world, and forgive me, but the Islamic world, of which the Arab world is sort of the fountainhead. The Islamic world is like infamous for not owning up to their sins. And so you have two cultures, one which refuses to acknowledge their shortcomings and one that revels. And then what Satan does, Satan is very good at judo. Okay, judo is different than other forms of martial arts where you strike, blow, and attack. Judo is you use someone's leverage against them. They come in with a strike, you just pull them through and throw them on the floor, and their own inertia just throws themselves down. So whereas the Western world is very good at groveling in our weaknesses and shortcomings, Satan pushes us to where we go too far and we think we're just the worst, most horrible thing in the world. Oh, I'm so bad. Like every time you get a more progressive Democrat American president, what do? What did Obama do when he got into office? He traveled around the world and literally apologized. Like, think about that. Of all the nations in the world that have to apologize, is it Iran that's expanding its terrorist networks throughout the Middle East and suffocating the life out of its own people, crushing, beating women in the streets because they won't cover their head? Who should be apologizing, the United States or Iran? Who should be apologizing, the United States or Russia? You know what I'm saying? But no, we're always the first to apologize, to grovel, to say how pathetic and horrible and bad we are. And some of those things are good, but like whenever someone confesses too much, you're just like, oh, this is cringy. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like there are limits to these type of things, and that's where we are as a people. So the left, interestingly, they maintain the values of repentance, but they take it too far. And they frame us as the worst in the world, and we're not. We're actually still a source of tremendous positivity and influence, and even gospel influence throughout the world. So that's like the very first thing. The United States simply does not meet the biblical descriptions there.
Hey guys, I want to remind you about our $5 a month giving campaign. If you want to have an impact on the unreached and unengaged of the world, if you want to see the gospel go forth into the 1040 window, it's as simple as giving $5 a month. We like to say you could give up a cup of coffee and change the Middle East. If you're interested in doing so, you can check out the link below. I believe it's faimission.org/donate or faistudios.org/donate. Thank you very much.
Now, faced with this problem, the author R.A. Coombs, he says, well, yeah, we don't represent a false religion, but we bow at the feet of Lady Liberty. And I go, okay, you don't think that's a stretch? That we worship liberty? I go, I don't think we worship liberty. I think we celebrate liberty. I think we view it as a positive thing. I think we view it as something worth fighting for. Look, and then you'll get Christians that go, we shouldn't fight for liberty. No, we shouldn't fight for that. We should lay down. We should embrace the cross. We should die as martyrs. I go, look, as a missions organization, when we're working in other countries, we are fighting for freedom, for liberty. When people are oppressed, we're fighting for their deliverance. The Bible says, pray for those that are in prison. Like, liberty is a good thing. Yes, the cross takes priority. The gospel takes priority. But that doesn't mean that we just roll over and die. I will fight for freedom for those who are oppressed. You go, yeah, but will you fight for your own liberty? That's my own personal decision. The point is this, liberty is a good thing. The United States doesn't bow at the feet of Lady Liberty. That's not our religion. We simply hold it up as something that's worth defending and fighting for and pursuing. Justice, it's another example. We don't bow at the feet of justice, but justice is a good thing. Those who follow the tenets of the Bible, those who follow the Lord will pursue justice. The Lord himself pursues justice. The Lord himself pursues liberty, of course, liberty in the spirit, not liberty. What's the word I'm looking for? Not licentiousness. While idolatry often manifests in more subtle ways, again, consumerism, materialism, idolizing liberty, this type of thing, to compare the values of freedom, equality, as I said, civil liberties, that underscore the Constitution of the United States, and to try to say that's what the Bible is talking about when it describes this blood-thirsty, disgusting, vile prostitute, it's ridiculous. I'm sorry. Like, it's beyond a stretch. It's simply ridiculous. Revelation 17, the harlot, Babylon, is specifically emphasized as being drunk on the blood of the saints. Who are the saints? Really, biblically speaking, you can say it's both Israel and the church. It's both Israel and Christians. And the woman in Revelation 17 is the greatest source of persecution and martyrdom of the saints in the earth. The United States is not the primary source of the shed blood of Christians throughout the earth. You can look at a map. Again, Open Doors has produced an excellent map of the primary nations throughout the earth today that are killing Christians, where Christians are being killed, where they are being martyred. And of the top 40 nations, as I've already pointed out, overwhelmingly, except for North Korea and just a few others, overwhelmingly the top 40 are all Muslim majority nations. And you could go, well, the United States is funding the shed blood of the saints through its military-industrial complex and the funding of wars. And I go, even if you said that, it still doesn't even begin to come close. There are more Christians being killed right now at this moment as you watch this than in any time in human history. There are more right now. And the majority, the overwhelming, just numerically speaking, it's taking place under the umbrella of Islam, various forms of Islam. It's in Islamic majority countries where Christians are being persecuted. It's not the United States. The United States is also not the greatest source of hatred toward the Jewish people, who are also God's people. Okay, the United States, as I said, is the second location where Jews live in the earth. New York City, next to Israel. And yes, anti-Semitism is growing here, particularly in, interestingly enough, progressive hotspots, Berkeley and in different university campuses and so forth. But we are still the second greatest place of refuge in the earth for Jews. In Europe, it's getting really bad, where Jews are increasingly saying, we're going to make Aliyah to Israel or move to the United States. But it's getting really bad in various parts of Europe. The harlot is the greatest source of the shed blood of the saints. How can you make that fit? We're the single source of gospel proclamation, not fighting against. Now, that could change in the future, but it simply doesn't align with the United States right now. Now, in order to sort of get around this, Douglas Woodward, again, my friend, author of one of the co-authors of the book Last Babylon, he goes, well, it's talking about abortion. I go, that's not what the book of Revelation says. It says the shed blood of the saints. The shed blood of the saints. Those who keep the commandments of God and the testimony of Jesus. It says they're being beheaded because of their testimony of Jesus. Okay? It's not talking about abortion. It's not talking about the slaughter of the innocent. And abortion is the wholesale slaughter of innocent. It's like 50 million plus have been killed since Roe v. Wade in the United States. But if you look statistically at India, China, they've aborted way more than the United States, almost twice as much each. Okay, so the United States, even if you wanted to say it's about abortion, they could have potentially been saints. Because again, the text says it's the slaughter of the saints, the shed blood of the saints, not just innocent little lambs. It's not just talking about abortion. But even if you said, well, they could potentially be future saints, we're still not the worst. We're not even close. There are other nations that are slaughtering way more innocent little lambs than the United States, and I'm not trying to underplay the horror of almost 10 holocausts under the umbrella of health care, so to speak, in the United States. I'm not trying to underplay that, but that's not what the book of Revelation is talking about. So on the first and the second criteria that the Bible gives us about Mystery Babylon, the United States simply does not line up with it. It just doesn't. Again, we can really point. So this is the thing. Again, you can go, but 3 of the other fingers fit so good. Yeah, like you got this great city. It sits on many waters. It's great. I go, yeah, that finger fits fantastic. But these other fingers don't even begin to fit. Like you have to get out 3 shoehorns and try to jam it in there and push, and it still doesn't fit. And again, if all the fingers don't fit, then you must acquit. If all of the criteria laid out in the Bible do not align with this candidate that we're discussing, then you have to throw it away. In the book, The Final Babylon, for example, the authors cast every single founding father as either a God-hating occultist or a flat-out atheist. And again, this is what happens, is you only emphasize the negative. Yes, there was a lot of occultism and Masonic whatever mixture, and some of them were atheists, and some of them were, also all over the place. But some of them were really actually very godly, incredible men. Like, they weren't all bad. But when you're trying to cast something as bad, then that's all you're going to do, is just frame it as all bad. And that just sort of reveals the very unbalanced nature of this particular argument. Now, in the book, Final Babylon, so just, this is fun, this is why I included this. When I was doing research, I even found a reference to me, Joel Richardson. So this is what happens once you go down this path of looking for, trying to find a demon behind every tree because you're trying to frame something as bad. You just get in this mindset where everyone is evil. And it actually talks about me, and it says that I am possibly, it doesn't say clearly, it says I'm possibly a secret Muslim. And here's the quote, a Muslim not wishing to be exposed. So here I am, I'm a secret Muslim, I'm a plant. I'm a pretender. Once you go down the road of seeing everything as evil, seeing everything as demonic, seeing everything as a fraud, everything as fake, then even your own brothers and sisters are framed as deceivers, false Muslims. I just got a kick out of that. Moving on. Let me just say this before I transition into this next part. Why is all of this so grievous? Because as Christians, we should be aware of our shortcomings as a nation. We should be aware of our strengths. But as Christian leaders, our primary call right now, me as a father, I've got 5 kids. This is where I'm raising my kids, at least for now. I don't plan on moving to another country. We should be interceding. We should be following the biblical pattern of crying out and saying, Lord, have mercy on this messed up nation. Pour out your spirit. You've done it in the past. You can do it again. Like, I don't personally have tremendous, I'm a little bit of a pessimist. Forgive me, that's just the reality. I tend to be a little bit, I think I'm a realist, but I tend to be a little bit cynical, a little bit pessimistic. I have a hard time viewing a bright future for the United States, but the Lord has done things way outside of my faith level plenty of times. I like people with big faith. I like positive people. I like people who believe God for big things. And here's what I know is that what the Lord does is not contingent on my faith or your faith. And so as Christian leaders, as fathers, in the spirit, as real fathers, we should be primarily focusing on encouraging the church to pray and intercede for the United States, not to sort of step back and say, Lord, judge this filthy harlot. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, once you frame her as the harlot, then you just want to get out of the way and say, Lord, destroy her. You get this kind of, like, look, there are times I look out at what's unfolding in the earth right now. I look at school teachers trying to indoctrinate little 4- and 5-year-old kids to become transgender, and I'm just filled with anger. I'm like, I think of the words of Jesus, like, it would be better if that teacher was never born, because the destiny that they will inherit for putting a stumbling block and potentially, and quite often, ruining their lives spiritually, physically, and otherwise. You get these kids 5-6 years later, they're 18, they're like, what was I thinking? I listened to my school counselor, I cut off my breasts or whatever, ruined my life. I took all of these hormones and this and that, and now I'm 18, or 19, 20, and I realize I've ruined my life. And they're mad, they're bitter, and I look at that and I go, God, these are our kids. There is going to be hell to pay. Like, I get that. I get the anger. When you look out at the government, at the different things, you go, God, pour out your judgments. I understand that. But nevertheless, that's it's a carnal reaction. I mean, some of it's a godly reaction, but much of it is carnal. It takes a lot more spiritual discipline to say, yes, despite all of her shortcomings, Lord have mercy. Lord have mercy, because we as believers we can look out and see corruption in other people, but if we're not seeing it in our own lives, if we're not pulling the plank out of our own eye first, then it's going to be much easier to see everyone else as demonized and to see ourselves as deserving mercy and everyone else deserving judgment. But when you see all of the different ways in your own life that you deserve judgment, then it's much easier to intercede. And so when that religious spirit really gets released, you see people, they're just like, oh, America, let her burn. And I go, the same standard that you're calling fire down from heaven, if that touches your own life, you have no idea how much burning there's going to be. And that's a terrifying thing. As leaders right now, we need to be praying until there is nothing left. You pray for new life. You pray for revival. There's nothing we need more in the United States right now than revival. And the Lord can do it. And that's what we should be praying for, rather than just cursing and heaping condemnation and judgment. And believe me, there's plenty of reason for that. But that's also why we pray for revival. Today, groups throughout the earth like ISIS, Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, Jamaat al-Islamiyah, you name it, they are killing Christians. And people are going, the United States is the greatest source of the shed blood of the saints. I go, what are you talking about? You have very legitimate terrorist organizations that are like hunting Christians down. And that's irrelevant, but the United States is somehow the worst harlot in the earth. It just doesn't make sense. Numerous nations today are endlessly lobbying the UN and working to wipe out the state of Israel. The United States, and people criticize the United States for giving aid to Israel, we're still the greatest source of support for God's people, the state of Israel, of any other nation in the world. We are not the greatest source of persecution. We are not the greatest existential threat to Israel. And that's quickly turning and changing, again, when we have more liberal governments in place. But we are still one of the greatest supporters of Israel and the people of God, the gospel, throughout the earth. The United States is not the capital of the beast empire. Again, the woman rides the beast. They're in partnership. If you say the United States is riding the beast, then you have to identify the beast. You have to have a correlating view of the great false antichrist religion and the 10 nations, and you have to explain how we are riding that entity and how we are controlling that entity. And as I've pointed out, the best interpretation of the beast, of the seventh, yea, the eighth head of the beast, is Islam, the Islamic Caliphate, probably something that looks like a revived Ottoman Empire or something from that part of the world. The United States is not the capital of Islam. Like, it's just, again, the key to identifying the woman is to understand the beast, is to identify the beast, is to understand these 7 historical empires that have tried to wipe out the people of God. It's to understand the larger biblical narrative, this unfolding conflict between the seed line of the woman and the seed line of the serpent, to understand that Satan's people have been trying to wipe out the Jewish people. Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome, Islam. And then the Islam is the 7th that will come back as the 8th. The United States is not the capital of the reigning beast empire. The United States also does not sit in a desert. We've talked about this. John says, I was taken in the spirit, and there I saw a woman in the desert. Eramon in the Greek, or Eremos. She's literally in a desert. How does that apply to the United States? Because it's not just metaphorical. It's not, we're mystically, spiritually in a desert. That's not what it's saying. He literally saw her in a desert, and there's no explanation. It's not viewed as a symbol. It's viewed as real. The woman is literally, the city is literally sitting in a desert. You just can't make the United States fit that particular criterion. And so then what those who are arguing this position, as I said, what they do, because they really can't prove it very well from Revelation 17 and 18, they have to turn to Isaiah 14 and 15 and Jeremiah 50 and 51. These are 2 big prophecies that speak of judgment. They're oracles against Babylon. And I would argue which are primarily historical judgments. But they say, no, these are actually end-time prophecies. Now they have a whole bunch of more information that they can kind of selectively work through and try to find things that correlate to the United States. So again, in Coombs' book and in a couple of these books, that's what they do. They really focus on Revelation. I said 14 and 15. Isaiah 13 and 14, and then Jeremiah 50 and 51. So Woodward, Krieger, and McGriff in The Final Babylon draw a tremendous amount from these passages, as I said, does R.A. Coombs. Woodward specifically argues that the destroyer from the north that is spoken of in Jeremiah 50 and 51 talks about Babylon will be destroyed from the north. He says, well, that's obviously Russia that will wipe out the United States. The problem is, if you read the text, both Isaiah 13, verse 17, as well as Jeremiah 51, verse 11, it names the armies from the north, and it calls them the Medes. It says the Medes will destroy Babylon, and we know that happened historically. The Medo-Persian Empire defeated Babylon. It tells us who it is. It's not Russia. Russia is not metaphorically the Medes, or the Medes do not metaphorically represent modern-day Russia. So this is an example. You go, well, it says from the north. That must be Russia. Yeah, that fits. The problem is the text tells us that it's the Medes. It's not the Russians. So it's this type of thing. Like, it's a very selective pick and choose. You've got these Jeremiah 50 and 51 big chapters, and you can just sort of pull out little things and make it sound logical in the book. In Isaiah 13, verse 20, it says that after Babylon is destroyed, it says it will never again be inhabited or lived in from generation to generation, nor will the Arab pitch his tent there. Now let me ask you a question. Does this sound, just in reading that, no longer will the Arabs pitch their tent there, it will be but it will be a perpetual desolation. Does that sound more like the United States or something in the Middle East? Just asking. Again, if we're going to say Isaiah 13 is actually an end-time prophecy. And then it says this in Jeremiah 51, verse 63. When Babylon is destroyed there, they are cast into the middle of the Euphrates. Does the Euphrates represent the Mississippi River or the Atlantic or the Pacific Oceans or, whatever? No, it says the Euphrates River. When Babylon is destroyed, this is why I say it's first and foremost a historical prophecy of the fall of Babylon. It's cast into the Euphrates, not the Mississippi River. And it says, so shall Babylon sink down and not rise again. So in conclusion, again, forgive me for kind of sharing my opinion about the United States and some of these things and being a cheerleader for the United States, but I stand by that. When all is said and done, the United States as a candidate for Mystery Babylon, yes, it's a tremendous source of economic influence throughout the earth. No question. Wall Street, New York City. It's a tremendous source of influence through Hollywood. Absolutely. It's a nation that is increasingly becoming corrupt, immoral. Absolutely. But on some of the main primary biblical criteria of being the greatest source of false religion, it falls down. It fails. The finger doesn't fit. It's just the opposite. The United States is the greatest source of gospel proclamation throughout the earth, both ideologically in terms of messaging and financially. It's a city on a hill. It still is. It's corrupt. It's broken. It's falling. But it's still a source of tremendous good throughout the earth in pursuing liberty and fighting against the evils of communism and radical socialism. It's still a positive force. So yes, there are some ways in which some of the fingers seem to fit, but when you do your homework, when you examine this theory more critically, there are also some profound ways in which it simply does not fit. So amen and amen. I'm going to end it right there. Next week, I'm not sure exactly what I'm going to jump into next week. It's either literal Babylon or the Illuminati. That ought to be a good one. And then we'll have one final session, so 3 more after this, and then I'll be done with this very long series on Babylon, and Dalton will jump back in. So look forward to seeing you next week. Until then, God bless you all. Have a great week. And Maranatha.